this memorandum book was written by an old colored man.
James F. Brown may have been an old colored man, but he was not an ordinary one. Born a slave in 1793, James became a free man in 1828, and just 9 years later, he was a property owner and voter. For a black man in America before the Civil War, this was remarkable. How did a man born into slavery achieve freedom and economic independence? He cultivated it, like a gardener tends a garden. It took vision, hard work, and faith in himself to yield the fruit of freedom. Like a garden in spring, the new nation was full of promise for most of its people, but not all. Born a slave just 6 years after the ratification of the Constitution, James was not considered a citizen of his country. He did not even count as a man. As a slave, he was recognized by the Constitution as counting for only 3/5 of a man. As such, James did not have the rights guaranteed to white men by the new republic. For those born black in America, a bleak, dormant, and hopeless winter persisted. Little is known of James's early life. Born a slave in Maryland, by age 33 he had hired himself out for wages in Baltimore. A literate man, unusual for a slave, he probably learned to read and write as a youth through one of the local churches. He was also a free slave, one of a tiny minority who had a little latitude to conduct their own affairs, despite their slave status. This slight amount of autonomy and his literacy would prove fateful in the course of his life. After the Revolutionary War, many slaves in the Upper South had been freed entirely from slavery. In Baltimore, the free black population soon outnumbered slaves. James would have seen the opportunities freedom held for a hard-working man. The temptation to flee must have been irresistible. Encouraged by the promise of freedom made by a member of his owner's family, James set about creating a new life for himself. In September 1826, he married another slave, Julia Chase, and bought her freedom for $100. But the promise to free James was never honored. Frustrated, James finally fled north in August 1827, leaving behind a letter of explanation in which he carefully explained that he had no choice but to free himself.
I know that you will be astonished and surprised when you become acquainted with the unexpected course that I am now about to take. A step that I never had the most distant ideal of taking. But what can a man do who has his hands bound and his feet fettered? He will certainly get them loose in any way that he may think the most advisable.
James would no longer accept being considered 3/5 of a man. And manhood required freedom, even though escaping was extremely dangerous and the risk of recapture very real. In spring, hope comes alive as the ground is cleared and planted for a new season of growth. After leaving Baltimore, James and Julia Brown arrived in New York City. He found work there as a waiter at the home of the Verplanks, a prominent and wealthy old New York Dutch family. Even with a job in the North, James was not safe. A dinner guest of the Verplanks recognized him as a former slave. Threatened with forcible return, James only escaped re-enslavement through the intervention of Daniel Crommelin Verplank, who wrote to Brown's owner, Susan Williams, in March 1828 to arrange the purchase of his freedom for about $300. By 1829, James was working as a coachman and gardener at Mount Julian, the Hudson River estate of the Verplanks. Modeled on English formal gardens, Mount Julian's garden was designed by Mary Anna Verplanck, Daniel's precocious eldest daughter. At age 11, she researched and laid out the picturesque garden, which attracted many visitors from the Hudson Valley. Traditionally, men planned and oversaw ornamental gardens, but Mary Anna was a self-reliant woman. She never married, living a life of independence unusual for women of her time. Like James, Mary Anna sought a level of freedom greater than the limits antebellum American society typically allowed for either blacks or women. In this respect, they had a natural affinity, which combined with a love of gardening, formed the basis for an unusual and lifelong friendship.
The normal and prescriptive role for women before the Civil War, particularly women of Mary Anna's station, was to be a wife and a mother. Mary Anna was able to conform to these expectations, even though she wasn't married, partly because she was such a great aunt to her many nieces and nephews. But she moved even beyond that in her domestic duties outside of the house, in her supervision of the estate and particularly the garden. When James came along, it was only natural that as he moved into the role of being master gardener, that they would have a relationship, that they would have a working relationship, and it seems that it was very productive.
James is proving to be a natural gardener. He seems to know instinctively what will succeed and what will not. And if he doesn't know, he sets out to acquire the knowledge from experts in the area.
February 25th, 1844. Heard the bluebirds sing this afternoon.
Around the time he came to Mount Julian, James started a journal, which he kept continuously for 37 years.
April 28th, 1829. The carpenters began the fence around the new garden.
In it, he recorded the ordinary details of daily life, season after season.
1835. Planted out peach trees, cherry trees, pear trees.
Brown began entering horticultural exhibitions, sometimes winning cash prizes.
Presented some Savoy cabbage and celery to the Horticultural Society and had a premium awarded for both.
The horticultural world at this time was a closed society of wealthy white men, not typically open to blacks.
So in order to participate in this horticultural world, you needed time, money, and education. This was a purposeful kind of avocation for these men. James could participate because he had time as a gardener. His time was all about horticulture. He had money that was supplied by the Verplancks. And he had knowledge because he was literate and because he apparently read horticultural publications. He also went out of his way to connect with gardeners, servant gardeners, and also high-end horticulturalists like the Verplancks themselves up and down the Hudson Valley.
James' journal records that Mary Anna entered similar exhibitions.
July 30th, 1830. Miss Mary Verplanck and Mr. D.L. Walton left Fishkill for New York. Presented some lima beans to the Horticultural Society for exhibition, for which there was a premium awarded.
As a woman, she was just as excluded as James, perhaps more so. While he probably needed sponsorship from horticultural associates to attend, she was required to be accompanied by a male.
James entered produce from his garden at the Newburgh exhibition last month. He inspired me to try my own at New York, and to my astonishment, I won a prize.
As Mount Julian's gardener, Brown regularly interacted with prominent horticulturalists in New York.
August 19th, 1836. Went to Mr. Downing's with some apple buds.
A.J. Downing was right across the river. Anybody who was a serious horticulturalist would have gone there. James is having regular interactions with A.J. Downing. He connects not only with people at that level, but he also connects with master gardeners on these estates. He connects by the exchange of plantings, and it seems that he connects by social visits.
July 23rd, Mr. J. Downing of the Botanical Garden at Newburgh paid us a visit.
It is because of the patronage of the Verplanks. This would be unusual for a black man, but he has their stamp of approval, and he has their stamp of approval in an activity that they care about.
Before long, Brown was promoted to Master Gardener, an event he noted obliquely in his journal.
Saturday, 12th, March 1836. Resigned my place as coachman this day.
Despite his modesty, this was an important event. Through talent and hard work, he advanced through the ranks from the lowest, garden laborer, to the highest, Master Gardener.
James has acquitted himself admirably of late. I'm so happy to turn over responsibility for managing the hired help and the accounts. And he keeps the garden blooming wonderfully.
In the 9 years since his escape from slavery, he had become legally free and achieved a degree of economic security. But for James F. Brown, this was not enough. Following winter dormancy and the preparations of spring, in summer a garden begins to mature and bear fruit.
July 7th, 1837. Took some peas and beans to Newburgh.
Just 5 months after his promotion,
haymaking and hauling.
James F. Brown bought a house in nearby Fishkill Landing.
August 2nd, 1836. Paid $100 to P.C. DeWent for lot number 37 on Division Street and received a deed for the same.
For the former slave, buying property meant more than just owning his own home. It meant he could vote. At that time in New York State, any white man over the age of 21 could vote, but black men were required to own property. Brown later owned a house on Beacon Street. Owning property brought James a step closer to some measure of citizenship and freedom. He cast his first vote in the very next election.
Wednesday, November 8th, 1837. The election at Fishkill took place this day, at which place James F. Brown voted for the first time.
In a journal full of weather and work reports, the page devoted to his first vote is significant. Despite his understated manner, the fact that he recorded the event in the third person indicates that he recognized how unusual and historically significant it was for an African-American man to vote in New York State in 1837.
November 7th, 1838. Went to the election at Fishkill, voted and returned.
He was so proud of participating in the electoral process that he recorded almost every election for the next 20 years.
March 14th, 1854. Town meeting today went up to Fishkill. Voted for town officers.
In many ways, Mary Anna, as an independent woman in the early 19th century, was just as unusual as James was in being an independent man of color. Most women were married, and as such were denied the right to own property. However, as a single woman, Mary Anna had this right. During her lifetime, she bought and sold at least 20 pieces of property. But this did not confer upon her the right to vote that it did for James.
October 19th, 1837. Very busy gathering apples.
Fall is harvest season.
1838. Took some passion flowers over to Mr.
A time
Neville's
when the rewards of imagination, faith, and hard work are reaped.
Gathered the grapes for winter this day and began packing them in cotton.
James's life was rich with the rewards of his labor. He raised himself up from bondage to be a well-respected man of property who paid taxes and voted, a citizen in all but in name. James died in Fishkill Landing, now Beacon, New York, in January 1868, 6 months before ratification of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. This amendment, passed in the wake of the Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation, extended citizenship to all those born in the United States, granting them many of the same rights James worked so diligently and faithfully to achieve for himself. As Master Gardener at Mount Julian, James knew that, What he planted and tended would ultimately bear fruit. He applied this knowledge to his life, believing that he would reap the harvest of his hard work. James F. Brown was never reflective in his journal, as was the custom of the time, but he did allow himself one observation. This memorandum book was written by an old colored man, contains a record of his marriage and of purchasing his wife's time for $100. This page is about recording the deed, he wrote in an undated entry. While at first he seems to express modesty about himself, the fact that he kept the journal for nearly 40 years to record the facts of his life reflects a view that the life he cultivated was worthy of note.